You saw me without my dress. Now marry me, or the Apache will punish us both. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sun was slipping lower in the sky, pouring gold over the desert like molten metal, as the lone cowboy guided his weary horse along a narrow trail. He had been riding for days, his saddle creaking with every step, dust clinging to his clothes like a second skin. The last trading post was 2 days behind him, and the quiet of Apache territory stretched ahead like an unending, watchful silence. He wasn't supposed to be here long, just pass through, keep his head down, and avoid trouble. That was the plan. The land around him shifted into a gentle slope, where rocky walls curved inward and shadows pooled between them. From somewhere ahead came the sound of rushing water, a welcome sound in the dry, breathless heat. He nudged his horse forward, the promise of cool water making his throat ache in anticipation. The canyon walls closed in around him, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, and the air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of wet stone. He dismounted, letting his horse drink from a shallow stream that wound its way out of the canyon. Kneeling, he cupped his hands and splashed water onto his face, the chill of it a sharp relief against his sunburned skin. That's when he heard it. Not the water this time, but a soft, almost musical ripple of sound. A voice. A laugh, maybe. He straightened, his eyes scanning the stream ahead. And then he saw her. She was in the water, waist deep, the surface shimmering around her. Her long black hair, wet and heavy, clung to her bare shoulders as she turned slightly, unaware of his presence. The late sun lit her skin in a warm, copper glow, and for a moment the cowboy's breath caught, not in desire, but in shock. He knew enough of Apache customs to realize what this meant. This was a place of privacy. He should not have been here. A small pebble shifted beneath his boot, and the sound betrayed him. Her head snapped toward him, her eyes locking onto his. For a heartbeat, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. She didn't scream. She didn't hide herself beneath the water. Instead, she moved toward him with quick, purposeful steps, the water rippling in her wake. By the time she reached the bank, her expression was fierce, almost urgent. "You saw me," she said in a low, controlled voice. Her accent was thick, her English careful, but her meaning was clear. She stepped closer, dripping water onto the dusty stones between them. "You saw me without my dress." The cowboy took a step back, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "I didn't mean—" "You don't understand," she interrupted, glancing sharply toward the canyon mouth, as if expecting company. Her breath came fast, her dark eyes burning into his. "In my people's law, this is forbidden. If they know, they will punish us both." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. He could hear the distant, restless call of a bird overhead, the wind tugging at his hat brim. Something about her tone, about the urgency in her movements, told him this wasn't just a matter of embarrassment. This was life or death. She stepped even closer now, so near he could see the droplets sliding down her cheek. Her voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to press against his ear, urgent and final. "You saw me without my dress. Now marry me, or the Apache will punish us both." The cowboy stared at her, unsure if he'd heard right. The canyon's narrow walls seemed to press in around them, amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat. She stood there barefoot, water still dripping from her hair, her gaze locked on his as if daring him to argue. "This law of yours," he began slowly. "You mean to tell me—" "It is not mine," she cut in, her voice low but edged with steel. "It belongs to my people. If a man sees a woman without her dress and she is not his wife, it is shame on her. On him, too. Shame is not forgiven. Only marriage makes it right." He blinked, the weight of her words settling over him. "And if I say no?" Her jaw tightened. "Then they will kill you." The words were delivered so plainly, so matter-of-fact, that for a moment he wondered if she was bluffing. But her eyes, dark, unwavering, told him she wasn't. He shook his head slightly. "That's a bit extreme, don't you think?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It is the way it has always been. Refuse, and they will see you as a thief of honor. Refuse, and I will also be punished. They will believe I tempted you, that I broke the law myself." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I do not want to die, and I think you do not either." The cowboy's mind spun. He'd come to this canyon for water, not a wife. Yet here he was, standing in front of a woman who claimed their lives now depended on a ceremony neither of them had planned. Somewhere in the distance, a faint cry echoed, high, sharp, and foreign to his ears. It rose above the whisper of the wind and was answered by another. His head turned instinctively toward the sound. "They know I left camp," she said, urgency seeping into her tone. "If they find you here, if they see us together—" She didn't need to finish the thought. A sudden unease twisted in his gut. "How many?" he asked. "Enough," she replied without hesitation. Her glance darted toward the rocky slope behind them. "We must go, now." Without waiting for his agreement, she moved past him, her bare feet quick and sure on the canyon floor. He followed, his horse's reins gripped tightly in one hand. They took the narrow trail that snaked upward between jagged walls, the sound of their breaths mingling with the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. Another call rang out, closer this time. Not a bird, not an animal. Human. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. "You're certain they'd kill me?" he asked, still clinging to a shred of doubt. She glanced over her shoulder. "You are a stranger in our land. They would not think twice." The trail steepened, forcing them to slow. Loose stones tumbled underfoot, clattering into the shadows below. His horse snorted, uneasy. When they reached a small plateau, she paused just long enough to catch her breath. Her eyes scanned the open stretch ahead, searching for movement. The wind tugged at the loose strands of her hair, but her focus never wavered. He studied her for a moment. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't pleading. She was simply resolute. Finally, he asked, "If I marry you, what happens next?" Her gaze shifted to him, and for the first time, a faint, unreadable smile curved her lips. "Then you belong to my people. For life." They moved fast, climbing higher into the rocky pass until the canyon lay far below. The air grew thinner, sharper, the wind carrying a faint tang of juniper and dust. Behind them, the sound of distant cries still drifted on the breeze. Signals, warnings, maybe even orders. The cowboy didn't need to understand the words to know their meaning. They were being hunted. He mounted his horse quickly, pulling her up behind him. She moved with practiced ease, one arm circling his waist, the other clutching a small bundle she'd carried from the stream. A folded dress and little else. Without another word, they kicked into a gallop, the horse's hooves hammering against the earth in a steady rhythm. The desert opened before them, a wide sun-baked expanse of ochre and gold. Mesquite bushes dotted the ground, their shadows thin and spindly in the late afternoon light. Far in the distance, red cliffs rose like ancient walls, and somewhere beyond those lay the cowboy's route home. But between here and there, the Apache riders would close the gap fast. After miles of silence, her voice finally rose above the pounding of the hooves. "My name is Ayoka," she said, the syllables smooth and certain. "It means she brought happiness." He glanced over his shoulder at her, though the name sat strangely against the tension in her eyes. "Ayoka," he repeated, as if testing its weight. She looked ahead, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was born in the winter, when snow covered the mountains. My mother died before I could speak. My father was a warrior. He never returned from war." She paused, the wind carrying her words away almost before he could catch them. "I was raised by my uncle. He is a chief, and with that comes many enemies. They look at me not as a woman, but as a way to gain power." The cowboy felt her grip on his waist tighten slightly. "One man in particular," she continued, "has wanted to marry me since I was a girl. Not for love, for what marrying me would mean. If I refused, he would find a way to take me anyway. Now, with what happened at the stream, he will see it as his chance." He frowned, the situation coming into sharper focus. "So this isn't just about me seeing you. This is about him." "Yes," she said simply. "If you marry me, you take away his claim. If you refuse, he will use this against me. Against both of us." Her tone was steady, but he caught the faintest tremor in her voice. She was afraid, though whether it was for herself or for him, he couldn't yet tell. They rode until the sun dipped low, painting the desert in bands of crimson and shadow. When the horse began to slow, its breaths coming harder, the cowboy pulled them toward a cluster of boulders where the land dipped just enough to break the wind. Here they dismounted, tying the horse to a scrubby mesquite. Ayoka spread her blanket on the ground, while he gathered dry brush for a fire. The sky above was vast and cold, stars already beginning to pierce the deepening blue. The first spark caught, and soon a small flame licked upward, throwing warm light across their faces. They ate little, just jerky from his saddlebag and a handful of dried berries she'd carried. The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its voice long and mournful. As the night deepened, the cowboy studied her across the flames. In the flicker of the firelight, her features softened, the fierce set of her jaw giving way to something quieter, almost vulnerable. He wondered if she trusted him yet, or if she was simply clinging to the one chance she had left. A gust of wind swept through, and with it came a faint, unfamiliar sound. Not the howl of an animal, not the shift of stones, something deliberate. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing into the darkness beyond the fire's edge. The flames danced, shadows stretching long across the rocks. And in that moment, between the crackle and the hiss, he saw movement, shapes that didn't belong to the desert's stillness, figures crouched low, slipping closer. They'd been found. The moment the figures moved in from the darkness, the campfire became a trap. Apache warriors emerged in a half-circle, their faces streaked with paint, their eyes cold and unblinking. The cowboy's hand went instinctively to his revolver, but a sharp voice barked in their language, and a spear's point touched his chest before he could draw. Ayoka stood quickly, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. She spoke fast, her words flowing in the tongue of her people. The men didn't soften. Two of them stepped forward, binding the cowboy's wrists with rawhide, pulling the knot tight enough to bite into his skin. Another yanked his hat away, tossing it into the dirt. The leader, a tall warrior with a hawk feather tied in his hair, motioned sharply. They were forced to walk, surrounded on all sides, the cold night air heavy with the smell of horses and wood smoke. It wasn't long before the flicker of firelight appeared ahead. The Apache camp. Hide tents ringed the clearing, their painted patterns glowing faintly in the fire's light. Children peered from the shadows. Dogs barked low and restless. The council was waiting. They were brought to a large fire at the center, where the elders sat in a half-moon of woven blankets and carved staffs. Faces lined with years studied the captives. Ayoka stepped forward, speaking quickly, her voice steady but urgent. The cowboy understood none of it, though her tone told him she was defending both of them. When she finished, a murmuring rose among the elders. From the far side, a man stood, younger, broad-shouldered, with a cruel sort of smile. His gaze lingered on Ayoka like a claim. He spoke, and though the cowboy couldn't grasp the words, the meaning was clear enough in the sneer on the man's lips and the way others nodded along. Ayoka's jaw tightened. She replied sharply, her words snapping like a whip. The man's expression darkened. He gestured toward the cowboy, and the murmurs grew louder. One elder, his voice deep and measured, addressed the gathering. He pointed first to Ayoka, then to the cowboy, then to the fire. The air between each word felt heavier, more final. When he finished, the hawk-feathered warrior translated into halting English. You saw her. You are not her husband. This is shame. Shame brings death, but... He paused, his eyes narrowing. If you marry her, you live. At sunrise. The meaning hit like a hammer. The cowboy swallowed hard. His wrists ached from the bindings, but that was nothing compared to the weight of what he was being asked. No, forced to do. Ayoka turned to him, her face unreadable in the firelight. She didn't speak, only held his gaze. Somewhere behind her eyes, something moved. Desperation, perhaps, or a glimmer of relief. The cruel-smiled man stepped forward, speaking again in their tongue. His voice rose, edged with challenge. He pointed to himself, then to Ayoka, then to the cowboy. The crowd reacted, some with laughter, others with low disapproval. He says you are not worthy, the hawk-feathered warrior explained flatly. He wants her. He says he will take her if you will not. The cowboy looked at Ayoka, whose stare hardened. He is my uncle's rival, she murmured in English, so soft the elders couldn't hear. If he wins, I lose everything, and so will you. The council's decision came swiftly. Marry her at sunrise or die where he stood. The cowboy felt the walls closing in. Not walls of wood or stone, but of custom, of law, he had no say in. A man could fight against bullets and fists, but what was he to do against the will of an entire people? They were taken to a smaller fire near the edge of the camp. The bindings on his wrists were cut, though two warriors remained close, watching. Ayoka sat beside him, her face lit in warm flickers of orange and gold. For a long while, neither spoke. The night sounds of the camp, laughter, drum beats, the low hum of voices, filled the space between them. Then, finally, she leaned slightly toward him. Her breath was warm against his ear, her voice barely more than a whisper. This was never about saving my honor, she said. It's about saving my life. The sky was still deep indigo when the drums began. Their low, steady rhythm pulsed through the camp like the beat of a single great heart. The cowboy lay on the thin blanket they'd given him, staring at the glow on the horizon. He hadn't slept, not with the knowledge of what sunrise would bring. A warrior entered the tent flap without knocking, his face painted in streaks of black and red. He spoke a short command, then gestured for the cowboy to follow. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting his lungs. The first blush of morning lit the tops of the surrounding cliffs, painting them in shades of rose and gold. The camp had gathered in a wide circle, the fire at its center now roaring high, throwing sparks into the fading night. The women's faces were painted in bright colors, their hair adorned with beads and feathers. Men stood in a line, their chests bare but decorated with painted symbols, each carrying spears or bows. Ayoka stood at the far side of the fire, dressed in a white buckskin dress fringed with thin strips that swayed with the breeze. Tiny shells and turquoise beads were sewn into the fabric, catching the light when she moved. Her hair was braided and wrapped with red cloth, and across her forehead was a strip of white paint, a mark of purity. She didn't look at him right away. An elder approached the cowboy, holding a small pouch of crushed ochre. Without a word, he painted 2 red lines across the cowboy's cheeks, then tied a strip of deerskin around his forehead. Another man brought forward a handful of sage, its earthy scent filling the air as it smoldered in the fire. The smoke curled around them, a blessing meant to drive away evil spirits. The elder raised his hands, speaking in the Apache tongue, his voice deep and rhythmic, each word punctuated by the beat of the drums. A young boy translated for the cowboy in broken English. "You stand here to take her as your wife. You will care for her, protect her, honor her. If you break these, you break with us." Ayoka's eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, the firelight caught a glimmer of something. Fear, or maybe resolve. Then her gaze shifted quickly, landing on someone in the crowd. The cowboy followed it and found the broad-shouldered man from the night before, her rival suitor, standing at the edge of the circle. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched at his sides. The ceremony began in earnest. Ayoka stepped forward, holding a small clay bowl filled with water from the stream where they'd first met. She offered it to him, and he drank, the cool taste almost shocking in the dry morning air. In turn, he handed it back, and she drank as well. The elder explained that this was the sharing of life. As water gave the desert life, so would they give each other strength. Then came the cord. A length of braided yucca fiber, dyed red and yellow, was draped over their joined hands. The elder wrapped it 3 times, each loop accompanied by a phrase in Apache that the boy whispered roughly into English. One life, one path, one fate. The drums quickened, and the women began to sing, a high, lilting melody that rose and fell with the beat. The cowboy couldn't understand the words, but the emotion in them was clear. A call for blessings, for protection, for a future. At last the elder removed the cord and held it high for all to see. He spoke a final phrase, and the boy translated with a small, shy smile. "You are husband and wife." The crowd erupted in cheers, though the sound carried an undercurrent of something heavier. The rival suitor's eyes burned into the cowboy's back as people moved forward to offer gifts. A blanket, a carved wooden bowl, a necklace of small polished stones. A feast followed. Fresh bread baked on hot stones, roasted venison, and bowls of berries passed from hand to hand. The cowboy sat beside Ayoka, the fire between them and the rest of the gathering. He was still trying to make sense of the knot in his chest. Part fear, part curiosity, part something deeper he didn't want to name yet. Ayoka barely ate, her eyes darting often toward the man in the crowd. When he caught her gaze, his lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile that made the cowboy's stomach twist.
Then, under the cover of conversation and laughter, she reached beneath the table and found his hand. Her grip was firm, almost fierce. Leaning close so only he could hear, she whispered, "Now you're my husband, and my shield." The sun had barely begun to sink when the whispers reached the cowboy's ears. The low murmur of the crowd around the evening fires wasn't in celebration anymore. It carried a sharper edge, words passed in quick glances and pointed stares. She sat beside him, her face calm to anyone who looked, but he noticed the way her fingers twisted the hem of her woven shawl. When the others began to drift toward the drums, she leaned closer, her voice no more than a breath. "He's going to challenge our marriage tonight," she said. Her eyes darted toward a tall figure across the firelight, the same man she had watched with unease at their wedding. "Under tribal law, he can take me away if he defeats you in the council's trial." The cowboy didn't respond right away. He'd been learning enough about Apache law in the last few days to know she was telling the truth. A rival could strip away a husband's rights with the approval of the elders. And that rival, her rival, looked like a man who wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. "So what are you saying?" he finally asked. She turned to him fully, her dark hair falling over her shoulder. "I'm saying if we stay here you'll lose me. If I lose you, I lose my shield." Her words settled like a stone in his gut. He'd thought about running before, on the day they first met, when war cries echoed through the canyon, and again during the council's judgment, but something kept him tethered. Now she was offering him the choice he thought he wanted, yet it felt less like freedom and more like stepping into a storm. They waited until the celebrations grew loud, until the drums and singing swallowed the crack of footsteps on dirt. Her hand found his, small but steady, and they slipped away into the shadows beyond the firelight. The horses were tethered just outside the main camp. She moved quickly, whispering to the animals in her native tongue as she freed them from their ropes. "We'll head north," she said. "There's a pass in the rocks. They won't expect us to take it at night." The first part of the ride was silent but tense. The night air carried the scent of sagebrush, cool after the heat of the day, but every rustle in the darkness made the cowboy's hand twitch toward his rifle. She rode slightly ahead, her braids swinging against her back, guiding them through narrow washes and low hills that swallowed the moonlight. It felt like hours before he spoke. "If we make it out, what then? Where will you go?" She didn't look back. "Where we go," she corrected softly. "If I leave alone, they'll find me. If you leave alone, they'll find you. We're bound together now, whether you like it or not." It should have felt like a burden, but there was something in the way she said "we" that struck him differently. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkness. For a moment he thought they might have pulled it off. Then, faint but undeniable, came the sound, hoofbeats. Multiple riders. The hairs on his neck stood up. "Ride," he barked, kicking his horse forward. She didn't question him. The two of them plunged into the desert night, the moon breaking through the clouds just enough to throw silver light over the sand and rock. The hoofbeats behind them grew louder, faster, until they could hear the sharp calls of their pursuers. The pass came into view, a jagged crack in the cliffside. "There," she shouted, pointing. They pushed the horses hard, the animals breathing ragged in the cold air. Loose stones clattered under hooves as they entered the narrow trail, the walls rising high on either side. If they could just make it through, they could lose them in the canyons beyond. For a fleeting moment, hope flared. The sound of pursuit dulled behind them, replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat. The cowboy risked a glance at her. Her eyes were bright, her face determined. And then it happened. The crack of a rifle shot tore through the night. Her body jerked violently, and before he could reach for her, she was slipping sideways from the saddle. "No!" he shouted, yanking his reins and leaping from his horse. She lay in the dust, the shawl around her shoulders darkening where the bullet had struck. Her breathing was ragged, her hand clutching at the wound. The hoofbeats were closing in again. He dropped to his knees beside her, torn between the instinct to scoop her up and the knowledge that the riders would be upon them in moments. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't let them take me." The choice he had been wrestling with for days was suddenly gone. There was no escape without her, and no life he wanted that didn't include her in it. He slipped his arm under her and lifted her onto his horse, the animal shifting under the sudden weight. As he swung into the saddle, the shadows of their pursuers spilled into the pass. With a sharp kick, he urged the horse forward, the animal surging toward the canyon's end. The night swallowed them once more, but this time the cowboy knew there would be no running without a fight. Just as they think they're free, a gunshot rings out, and she falls from the horse. The cowboy's arms burned from the weight of her as he carried her across the jagged rocks, each step echoing with the pounding of his own heart. The moonlight was pale, almost ghostly, and the only sound besides his breathing was the faint rustle of desert wind through the mesquite. Her head rested against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady, the warmth of her blood soaking into his shirt where the bullet had grazed her side. He found a narrow opening in the cliff face, barely visible in the darkness, and ducked inside, his boots crunching softly against the grit-strewn floor. The cave was small but deep enough to conceal them from prying eyes, its entrance shielded by overhanging stone and wild desert brush. He laid her down gently on a bed of dry sage leaves, his hands trembling as he tore a strip from his own shirt to bind her wound. She flinched, biting back a cry, but said nothing. The flickering light of his small fire, built deep inside the cave to hide the glow, cast warm shadows over her face, softening the lines of pain. For a long moment neither spoke. The tension of the chase still hung between them like a thick, unbroken thread. Finally she broke the silence, her voice a hoarse whisper. "You should have left me." He shook his head, rinsing the makeshift bandage with water from his canteen before tying it tight around her. "Couldn't do that." His voice was quiet but certain, carrying a weight that surprised even him. For days, he told himself he was only involved because of obligation, because the Apache Council had given him no choice. But here, in this cave, with her life in his hands, he felt something shift inside him, something that had nothing to do with duty. As the firelight danced on the walls, she told him the truth she hadn't dared to share before. Her rival, the man who'd tried to twist the council's judgment, was no ordinary suitor. He was the son of a powerful elder, a man who believed she was key to uniting two warring bands of the Apache under his control. Her refusal to marry him had turned into a matter of politics and pride. The marriage to the cowboy had been her only way out, but now, wounded and hunted, she feared her rival's reach could stretch far beyond the boundaries of her homeland. He listened, his jaw tightening. "If we stay here they'll find us," he said, glancing toward the cave's narrow entrance. "And if they do, I don't think they'll give me a second chance to walk away." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes dark and searching. "Then we can't stay. We have to go north, far north, beyond their lands, beyond their laws." Her words lit something in him. The thought of leaving everything behind, his ranch work, the familiar towns, the life he'd built in the dust and sun, should have been unthinkable. But instead the idea wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Not because of where they'd go, but because of who he'd be going with. As dawn's first light began to seep into the cave, he made his decision. They would ride north. Through mountains, across rivers, beyond the reach of the rival who wanted her and the tribe who wanted him dead. It was reckless, maybe even hopeless, but it was the only choice that felt right. The girl's breathing had steadied, her color returning little by little. He gave her a small piece of bread from his saddlebag, and they ate in silence, the weight of the day ahead pressing down on them both. Outside, the sky blushed pink and gold, and the desert seemed almost peaceful. Almost. He packed quickly, dousing the fire and brushing away the ash. Then he helped her to her feet, steadying her as she leaned into him for balance. Together, they stepped out into the morning air, their horses waiting just beyond the ridge. Her mare nickered softly, and the cowboy's bay gelding pawed the ground, sensing the urgency in his master's movements. They rode hard, following the edge of the foothills to stay hidden from open plains where riders could spot them miles away. Every now and then, she would glance over her shoulder, her hand brushing the handle of the small knife at her belt. He caught those glances and knew she wasn't just looking for pursuit, she was remembering everything she'd left behind. By midday the sun was high and the heat oppressive. They stopped in a dry wash to rest the horses, sharing the last of their water. The cowboy studied the horizon, scanning for any dust trails that might betray riders following them. For now there was nothing. But the desert had a way of hiding threats until they were almost upon you. When they set out again, she began to talk about a place she knew in the north, a valley with tall pines, cold rivers, and meadows that bloomed in spring. Her voice softened when she spoke of it, painting a picture so vivid he could almost smell the pine needles and feel the cool air on his skin. "It could be a good place to start over," she said. He didn't answer right away. Part of him still clung to the life he'd known, the simplicity of cattle drives and small-town saloons. But another part, a part that had been growing since the night he first saw her, wanted to see that valley, to make it their own. By late afternoon, shadows stretched long across the desert floor. The air grew cooler, but the tension only deepened. Every ridge they crossed felt like it could reveal danger. Every gust of wind carried the possibility of hoofbeats. And yet, they kept riding, bound by a silent promise neither had spoken aloud. They would reach that valley together or not at all. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and crimson, they made camp in a narrow canyon, hidden among the rocks. He built a small fire, careful to keep it shielded, while she rested against her saddle. They shared a simple meal and for a brief moment, it felt like they were already free. But freedom was a fragile thing. As night settled in, the quiet was broken by a sound both of them recognized instantly, faint at first, then growing clearer. The steady, rhythmic thunder of hooves on packed earth. The cowboy froze, his eyes meeting hers across the firelight. Neither spoke, but the truth was written plain on both their faces. Their past wasn't just catching up, it was already here. If you want to know whether they escape or are caught, the narrator's voice would say over the image of their tense faces in the flickering light, stay with us for the next chapter of this incredible true Western romance.